name is Bennett Greenberg. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Went to Weaver High, Trinity College, and was struggling during the Depression of the 30s to earn a living, which was fairly successful. And in the year of 1942, December, I was drafted for service in World War II. I was sent to Camp Pickett for initial training. When I finished, I stayed there as cadre, and at that time, they instituted a program called for special training in the Army, and in order to qualify, you had to take a test. Apparently, I passed the test, which was probably an IQ test, and I was sent to Georgetown University, which was the center for disposing of the troops to various areas. I was at Georgetown in Washington for about 6 weeks, and then was transferred to Rutgers University in Newark, near Newark, New Jersey. And I was at Rutgers for a whole year in a program that emphasized French language and speaking. The cadre, or the teachers, were all native French, none of whom spoke English. So that for a year we lived in the dormitories, exposed to nothing but French as far as the lingual side. Unfortunately, the demand on the Army for men caused them to do away with the program, and I was shipped to Camp Carson in Colorado. It was interesting. At that time, the troop movements were secret, and we got on a train that was of Civil War vintage, and we started to proceed west with the windows blackened. About 5 or 6 days later, the train stopped and they said, "All out." I got out and the sun was brilliantly shining, and this was in April. And I immediately saw a mountain peak that I recognized as the most famous mountain in the Rockies in Colorado, so I knew where I was. I trained in infantry in the 104th Division there in preparation to duty overseas. I was transferred from regular infantry to the medical corps because my basic had been in medics. At the time I was there, I was eventually shipped back to the East Coast, and we boarded a ship at night in Brooklyn and headed out to sea. Being in the under part of the ship for the first part of the trip, it was a surprise that when I came on deck the following morning, as far as the eye could see, I saw ships, and there were those boats that were defense against the German U-boats who were dropping bombs in the water, and it was an astounding sight. Well, about 7 or 8 days later, the flotilla sighted land. I said, "Where is that?" And they said, "It's France." We were the first American division to go into France without going to England first. We hopped off the boats and went in on assault boats, although there were no Germans there, because this was about, I would say, 6 weeks after D-Day. I was mesmerized by the amount of material that was on Omaha Beach at the time. There was just loaded with vehicles, food, fuel, everything imaginable, and it seemed almost an impossibility that so much could have been shipped, manufactured and shipped so far and be there. We bivouacked in Normandy for about a week or so, and we lived in shelter halves. And the very first day I wanted to test my French ability, I see a man running down the road gesticulating rather wildly, and I accosted him, and in French I asked him, "What's the story?" He said, "I need a doctor." I said, knowing that there were no vehicles there except the Red Ball Express, which was military, I said, "You're not going to get a doctor, but my captain is a doctor. Maybe we can help you. What's the problem?" He said, "My wife is having a baby." He was a typical farmer, and he took me and my captain, who was a young Texan just out of med school, to the farmhouse, and the doctor saw that the woman was in the throes of having a baby, and he said to me, "Sterilize my instruments." I said, "Captain, I don't want any part of this." And he said, "You've got to stay with me. I can't talk French." At any rate, it was a good test of my ability to communicate. And the woman, although she was a little frightened because the man in a military uniform didn't look like a doctor to her, she received my explanations, and it was fairly routine with a few minor exceptions, and she had a baby girl. In Normandy, the common drink is cider because of the apple orchards. But whenever I got, for the next week when we were there, whenever I got back to the farmhouse, I was given Calvados, which is the alcoholic beverage that's a brandy that's distilled from apple cider. And I had my chaplain baptize the baby, and he and I were able to get the alcohol in the Calvados form, whereas the normal GI coming through would get the everyday cider. I was shipped from there, the whole outfit was shipped from there right across France, and I'll never forget the ride because it was in a Jeep and over pretty poor roads, and we ended up in Holland. Went all the way across France. In Holland, we were assigned to replace a British infantry division, and we had a Canadian division on our right, Polish armored division on our left, and although we were assigned to the Ninth Army, which was under the command of General Montgomery, the Britisher, there were very, very few Brits involved. A lot of the artillery was Scotch. Actually, our mission was to make sure that Holland was cleared and the Germans were in retreat. Therefore, we were advised that the pipeline for gasoline and fuel had been laid across the channel, and we were supposed to secure the land so that that would be safe. We knew they were in retreat because when we asked the British whom we relieved what was happening, they said, we haven't seen the Germans, and of course they laid back pending the change. However, about 10 miles ahead of us, we made a first contact with the Germans, and it was my first battle experience. What they did was cover the road which we used, and this was flat with ditches on both sides. They covered it with machine gun fire, and they threw little wooden shoe mines into the ditches. As we advanced, they fired, and naturally the soldiers would go for cover to the ditches, and in one fell swoop, we had, I would say, about 20 casualties where men would have their foot blown off at the ankle or the knee, generally, from these shoe mines, because if you stepped on them, all they were a little piece of wood with dynamite and a detonator. The blast would knock off your limb. We had set up an aid station in a Dutch farmhouse in the kitchen, and we were treating the casualties, and it was really hectic. In one case, a lieutenant lost almost his whole leg, or he was going into shock, and the doctor decided that he'd have to amputate. Of course, in the battlefield, you didn't have all the instruments you would like, so he used a hunting knife to amputate the man's leg at the knee. And he handed me the boot and the leg and said, take care of this. So I started to walk out of the house to throw it in the field, and I felt a little woozy, almost to the point of fainting. When I got to the doorway, I flipped the leg into the field. It was quite heavier than I expected, but that was the first time that I had come close to fainting because of the casualties that were involved. thereafter I was steeled to it, and I never had that feeling again. As for myself, in advancing and with artillery coming in, I sensed an emotion I had never felt before. And I said, this must be fright, because it was totally new to me in my young life at that time. I had never experienced this emotion. At any rate, we finished our stint in Holland, taking the Mark River and Canal as the Germans retreated. And one of my co-medics had been a conscientious objector, a young fellow from South Dakota. And he got thrown into the medics because he objected to fighting with a weapon. And under fire at the Mark River and Canal and in foxholes, he reacted as the most common and bravest individual that I remember under stress. Anyway, we finished our mission, and we moved from there into Germany, and there was an experience when we saw the Dutch-German border. We relieved the 1st Division, who had just taken Aachen, which was the first German city to fall. That was interesting because of the fact that almost every house in Aachen was taken by hand-to-hand fighting, and it was a very pretty city with cobblestone streets. Had about 160,000 people originally, and I equated it with Hartford, Connecticut, or Springfield, Mass. And we set up an aid station in a house, and that had belonged to a German who was a doctor and who was in service with the Germans on the Russian front. I could tell from the correspondence, as I was able to read German, that was strewn in the house. And from there, through the Hurtgen Forest, was some of the toughest fighting that occurred in World War II. It was a moral victory to gain 200, 300 yards at the time. We actually progressed for a while at a very, very slow pace until as we were nearing the Rhine River, we took a small town, practically no casualties, set up an aid station in a school, and all of a sudden we're bombed by the U.S. Air Force, who made a hit on the school. I was crouching in the corner on the floor on the first floor and escaped injury. One of the men on the second floor of the school was blown out the window and landed unscathed in the field. But we had a few casualties, even though they weren't caused by the Germans. Eventually, we got to the Rohr River near the town of Düren, where we stayed because we had this river to cross in front of us. It was at that point that the Germans counterattacked and started the bulge, and they had good intelligence because the division on our right was 106th and a newly formed division without battle experience. They attacked and wiped out the 106th, which was our right flank. So here we were in the dead of winter, the farthest most into Germany of troops sitting on the Rohr River, and we had to wait for this counterattack to be repulsed. But we could have been surrounded if the Germans had successfully got around to segregate us without supplies. We stayed there from that December till Washington's birthday in February, when we had the go sign to attack across the Rohr River. The Germans had controlled the dam that was north of where we were, and they broke the dam, and what was a quiet stream became a raging torrent. When we were down to the river and trying to cross in assault boats, the boats were swept away and we lost quite a few men. And I was down in a factory right on the river bank, and we were sort of stymied. Just about before dawn, my captain, who was a doctor from Nebraska, named Ruska, the same name as a former representative or senator from Nebraska, said, come on with me. I said, where are we going? He said, we're going south. There's a detonated bridge, and we can cross the river on the rubble that was left by the bridge. So we walked about a mile, got to the bridge, and we started to cross, and you could see machine gun fire kicking up the water, and we got to a point where the bridge had been detonated and the rubble was just as high as the water, but the captain cupped his hands and lifted me so I could get up to the top, and they had me carrying a radio, portable radio for communications that weighed about 60 pounds. From that point, I made tracks as fast as I could to the nearest house, which I would say was about 200 yards, dived over 2 dead GI bodies, and got there. About a half hour later, the doctor made it, and from that point on, our mission was to set up an aid station on the other side of the river to take care of potential casualties. I was in an apartment house in town looking to set up an aid station, and in the hallway of the house I was standing along near my MAC officer. Artillery fire hit in the street and blasted into the hallway. Didn't touch me, but it hit the lieutenant in the groin. And I was able to get the captain to look at him, and he came out and actually cried. They were close because they were co-officers in the same outfit, And he said to me, "He can't make it. I can't stop the bleeding." It was traumatic because he was decorated with me in Germany when I got the Bronze Star and he got the Silver Star for evacuating a bunch of casualties. Anyway, I eventually got to the Rhine, and we went into the city of Cologne, the part of which we took. And at that point, they immediately sent us south, and we crossed the Rhine at Remagen, where the bridge had just collapsed, but the pontoon bridge had been built. And the bridgehead was maybe 10 miles once we got across. And we got to the Germans were on an airfield about 10 miles from the river. At that point, I hadn't been feeling well, and I didn't have a mental breakdown, but I couldn't digest food, and I got to the point where I was so weak I couldn't dig a foxhole. When the captain said, you better go back, and he told them to take me back, and I'll never forget that ride. I was glad to get back, and I had my fingers crossed they didn't hit the ambulance. When I got back, I was checked by a doctor at the evac hospital that was on the river, on the Rhine River, and he was from Middletown, Connecticut, and he said, well, he says, I can send you to Belgium or to Paris. Where do you want to go? I said, well, I'll take Paris. The very next day, it was a beautiful sunshiny day. I was loaded onto a plane, and I remember looking at the French countryside from up above, and it was probably the rockiest plane ride I ever took. We also had on that plane about 5 or 6 German casualties, mostly with broken limbs that were splinted. And every time that the airplane would drop and suddenly stop, these guys grunted and groaned. Eventually we got to Paris, where I was hospitalized for about a week. Then sent back to my outfit. This was 3 or 4 weeks later, and I got to reach them in Bonn, Germany, which was a beautiful college town, and I just couldn't take it. As soon as I got under fire again, I got to the point where it was difficult to digest food, and they sent me to an evac hospital in Belgium, where eventually I was diagnosed as not being able to take any more frontline action, and I was sent to a replacement depot that we had in Verviers, Belgium. That's the French-speaking part of Belgium, so I felt quite at home, and I got to know a lot of the natives while I was there, and I was very, very efficient as a three-cushion billiard player, and billiards is the national game in Belgium. I'll never forget that I beat most of the local guys because every gin mill or eating place has billiard tables. So anyway, I said, doesn't anybody, this was at Balkline Billiards, I said, doesn't anybody play three-cushion? They said, well, if you go into town, there's a billiard parlor there. You can ask the fellow who runs it. Maybe you can get a match. Of course, I liked the challenge, so I went in, I introduced myself. The fellow had a deformity in his leg. So we started to play three-cushion billiards, and I'm trying to hang in there, but eventually he executed a magnificent shot that takes a tremendous billiard stroke. I put my cue on the table, walked out. I said, I give up. When I got back, they asked me how I did that evening. They fixed me. He was the amateur three-cushion billiard champion of Belgium. They didn't tell me that. So it was pretty good competition. From there, I got to tell you about one experience that maybe shouldn't be publicized that I had. I was stationed at Compiègne, France, the site of the peace treaty of World War I and II, and in a replacement depot. And on occasion, I was able to take the ambulance and go into Paris, which was maybe 40 kilometers away. So a buddy and I actually took the ambulance one day, and we went to the PX in Paris, where we made a lot of purchases of cigarettes, soap, and other stuff that was traded in the black market in France. They had none of this. As we exited from the PX, I got the high sign from a civilian, and he told me to meet him in an apartment, first floor apartment, not too far away, which we did. So my buddy and I, he was a young college kid from Michigan, laid out all our stuff on the table in the dining room, and we haggled about the price, and finally we agreed on it, and the fellow gave me the amount that we arrived at, was probably about $110 or $120. When I hear the woman in the house running in, yelling, "Les flics," which means the cops in French. So I says to my buddy, we better get out of here. We packed all the stuff up, took it off the table, put it back in our knapsacks, and we got out and ran. I still had the money and the merchandise. I didn't realize that the cops were looking for the black marketeers, and they had no jurisdiction over American soldiers. Anyway, we stopped in a cafe shortly after. We met some other black market civilians, and I gave them the price, and they paid me, so I collected double on the merchandise. it was really because of my ability to bargain and to talk the language. I think that happened. Of course, we were sweating along about this time. The atomic bomb was used in Japan and they surrendered, and we thought we might be shipped to Japan. And it was a relief when the Japs surrendered. And eventually we were shipped to Northampton. We were shipped to Le Havre, and then we were shipped into England to go back to the States. And it was in the fall, and I never saw the sun the whole month of November that we were there. And it got tough because we were in former English barracks that were not well heated. They used fireplaces. Eventually, we got on the Queen Mary, got back, and I got discharged at Fort Devens, approximately 3 years of service with about half overseas and half in this country. When I was separated, the first job I got was for the War Department, where they had taken over a prep school in Avon, Connecticut called Old Farm School, and they used it to rehabilitate the GIs who were blinded before they were discharged. And I taught a course called Problems of Blindness. And my function was to refurbish or maintain the vocabulary of the blinded soldier, because once he lost his sight and didn't read, his vocabulary became more stilted than normal. It was an edifying bit of work, and I was there for close to a year when the mission was finished. The War Department closed it, and that was about the extent of my military experience, except that I missed telling you that while in Holland, one day, going up the road on an errand, and this British fighter plane came down and started to strafe us. I remember lying in the middle of the road and watching the machine gun bullets in the water hit the water in both ditches on either side of me. Fortunately, the pilot wasn't too accurate. His plane was later shot down by the Jerries, and one of the medics who had worn out his shoes took the flyer's boots to use. At that same time, we knocked out a German tank, and it was burning, and I'll never forget the sensation of smelling the burning flesh of the Jerries. I realize now, with the recent fires we've had in the nightclubs where people panic and get burned to death, how difficult it is to smell the burning flesh, which is uncommon. The total experience, war experience, had some positives. They got us into good physical shape. I have to commend the Army on the training, which was tougher than combat from the physical viewpoint. But the stress is very, very tough. I evacuated good soldiers. I remember evacuating in Germany a fellow who hopped off the roof onto a German tank, climbed up the gun, and threw a hand grenade down the muzzle of the gun. He was really a brave soldier. The next day I evacuated him because he cracked up. And that was an instance of combat fatigue, or whatever you want to call it, that I thought was unusual. It wasn't cowardice, because the guy normally was a gung-ho soldier, but after the while, the stress of battle has its toll, takes its toll. All of this story I never spoke much about, because I felt that we couldn't translate to the younger generation how bad war experience can be. And there was a sense of futility about it. It was only after 30, 40, 50 years that I even mentioned these things. So I am happy to help in any involvement that will help educate people to detest war. Guess that's it.